Ed and Audio Ultra here with Bill Lowe of Audioquest. Welcome here today to the listening rooms, and we're having some fun listening to cables and really inspired by the Mythical Creature series that Bill and Garth are ahead of down there at Audioquest, and looking to hear a little bit how we actually arrived at the Mythical Creature series of cable, starting on when you were developing cables back in Oregon, I guess it was. Can you kind of give us a little background on that and how that happened and where you got with Garth and how we are here today with the Mythical Creatures?
Every time you bought a new Jefferson Airplane album, a new Beatles, a new Hendrix, Doors, you were taking a drug you'd never taken before. You were being taken someplace you'd never been taken before.
You're going on a journey.
Yeah. And I'm still on that journey. I love it.
So you started off making cables.
So I started to make cables in 1978. Actually, I was very lucky. I was fortunate at the time in Fulton Brown and Fulton Cole.
Was Monster Cable at that point then, or
no? Monster was a year later. Lowell at that time was selling the 12-gauge Saxton electrical wire as a rep in Northern California. But Jonas Miller was starting to sell a cable just called Megami Cable because in the consumer marketplace, Megami, which is a big company like Belden or Canary making professional products, was an unknown. And they selected a high capacitance, low inductance coaxial cable, mimicking what Pope did with their Cobra cable that they brought in starting in '76, as being the way to make a better cable was to lower the characteristic impedance. It's wrong. You can't impedance match between two things that are purposely very, very different, which is the loudspeaker and the output of the amplifier.
Right.
And no loudspeaker has flat impedance. Even the best, it's just impossible.
Right.
And so Dave Gore went to a medical cable supplier in San Fernando Valley in Chatsworth and bought a 15-gauge finely stranded Litz cable and took it down to his friends at Middleton White and Kempf. They tied the conductors to a door handle and a drill, made a twisted pair. And this little 15-gauge cable, because you know electrical, this little 15-gauge cable, little compared to the aught-2 welding cable that they were using as their speaker cable.
Right.
And this little 15-gauge cable clobbered.
Interesting.
And so they got interested in having something made of what they'd learned and invited me to split the order with them in order to make it possible.
Oh, wow. Wow.
So
that's awesome.
It's an example of the core of Audioquest from my point of view, which is doing something when opportunity has been provided. Somebody else might have said, oh no, that's a commitment I can't make or whatever. Being provoked. But as with the designs, the improvements that I then made from that foundation, what I sort of call original recipe, was not my recipe.
Right.
It was a 12-gauge version of that 15-gauge cable, twisted pair, which does a whole lot of things right. I mean, Society of Motion Picture made years since 1929 knew enough to insist on twisted pairs. The phone system wouldn't have worked in the old analog days if with this parallel. These are real basics. And yet, speaker cable is defined as being zip cord.
Right.
A speaker manufacturer, from back east, Jerry Axelrod, worked for Crazy Eddie's, had a speaker company called Axiom in Redondo Beach. So
Crazy Eddie, the
retailer?
Yes,
the former retailer.
I remember him.
Criminal.
Yes.
Jerry was one of the people who worked in that store. He was.
And I'm not Crazy Eddie.
Just the far as you can get from it. Jerry invited me to come over with my cables because he wanted to investigate using what he might use it inside of his speakers. And so initially we were just going to listen on the outside. And I brought in with me at the time a 25-foot pair of speaker cable because that's pretty much what was normal in those days before remote control. That the whole system was over here where you could change the volume or change the record while the speakers were over there.
Right.
So long speaker cable, short interconnect. So I came in with these 25-foot pair of cables. We compared it to this is now late 79, the 10-foot pair of monster cable that he was using for his system, because he had his system all in the middle and was only using 10 feet. We made the comparison. It was not fair for price, and my cable was a more expensive cable, but it was gotta say,
right.
It was nice and obvious. But maybe I'm a little bit competitive because I had out in the car a 10-foot pair, and it is a given that a 10-foot pair is better than a 25-foot pair.
Right.
Speaker cable goes out of focus and loses dynamics with length. The Zero-Tech cables that you are dealing with from us do that less, but it's still a fact of life. Your speaker cable is version of entropy. Information is lost. There's a loss of focus and loss of dynamic contrast over length. And if you compare, using a normal cable for getting the zero techs, you compare a 6-foot cable to a 10-foot cable, you could say, what do you think of my new amplifier?
Right.
What's the difference?
Right.
Something called the rule of rights with magnetic fields. And again, you probably could explain this better than I can because you're in that world. But whenever there's the same...
Garth is in that world.
Okay, yes.
We just live in
but
it.
You're in it. Garth needed you as much as you needed him when it comes to some of the work you've done together. But the conductors attract when they have the same signal going through them. And so it's not that they were repulsed, but the attraction is a mechanical motion. Some of what accounts for why when you're jump starting the car, a cable actually can move.
Right.
Jump is almost not a wrong term. And in a Litz cable, as I was making, then at least the contact pressure between the strands being modulated is not itself a distortion mechanism where it would be with bare copper, where the strands are, no matter how clean they are copper oxides on the surface, and copper oxides are semiconductors. Their conductivity is modulated by the amount of current going through the conductor, and the contact pressure between the strands is modulated by the amount of current. So the musical signal is dynamic, and the distortion mechanisms are dynamic. So this was just the mechanical aspect, but nevertheless, the more tightly the strands are held, the less modulation of the cable. The medium is not being modulated by the energy it's carrying as badly.
Right.
And that was the mechanism that's how I discovered it. It wasn't textbook, it wasn't because I was a physics major or had electrical engineering or any proper background. All I was wide open-eyed kid trying to pay attention to things that I didn't expect.
Right.
And cumulatively, Garth's been wanting to make improvements for 3 years. He's the kind of person who would never stop thinking.
Garth, really?
And that's going to mean that whatever he's got in mind, there's room to be better. But when he came to Audioquest, the first thing he did was looked at what I was already doing with cable, because he figured because he's interested in all of audio, and he had been designing some cables starting decades earlier. And he looked at what he was, as a consumer, he already was using my cables, but he hadn't thought about them professionally.
Right.
So he investigated professionally, and the primary ingredient that...
And he's at the source. He's with you, so you're both together now, and he can feed off you and ask you questions. And
well, I can't explain the theory behind something as well as he could. So whether it's like I had the patent for having invented the dielectric bias system, although I'm the millionth person to be aware that dielectric involvement was an issue and that biasing a dielectric was advantageous. That was not new, but I did come up with a simple mechanism for putting that into a product efficaciously. But Garth understands DBS far better than I did, so I'm sideways here for a second. Years like audio research, I built the cables for audio research in the SP8, for example. They built that for me, and then they realized they didn't need to come to me for single conductor, and they got into the cable. Not just buying their own cable for inside, but for a while they made cables, audio cables, interconnects. And audio research, because those are the kind of company who listens and pays attention. Not everybody is, they are, were and are. That they sold shielded and unshielded interconnects because when you didn't need a shield, it's like a Band-Aid. If you don't need a Band-Aid, you're better off without one.
right.
You could say you always need a shield, but a shield is an antenna picking up RF and then broadcasting appreciable amount of that into the conductor side.
Correct.
And so they sold shielded and unshielded. Well, how do you tell somebody ahead of time when it's an environmental phenomenon which one's going to sound better? So I never did that, but it sort of haunted me that I wanted to have a predictable way of transcending either the shielded or unshielded as we knew of it. The use of carbon and multiple layers of shielding, building something that I didn't know. I built a carbon mesh network. That's language we use today because Garth could explain what I was doing.
Right.
That I was doing by feeling my way around in the dark.
But you had the intuition to design and try and by error and play with and assemble.
I was a scientist with insufficient knowledge.
A mad scientist.
Being scientific.
A mad scientist.
A little. A hedonistic scientist. And so noise dissipation. So I had done effectively enough that I could make a shielded cable that sounded better than a plain conductor in the air with no dielectric and no shield and none of the things that go wrong in a cable.
Right.
Because a whole lot less goes wrong. You just have two conductors.
Right.
except for susceptibility, and depending on context, that can then poison the whole relationship.
Right.
But for years, my reference for SPDIF, for a digital coax, was just two conductors with unshrunk heat shrink over them to just prevent them getting shorted too easily or something between two pieces of gear, an SPDIF out and an SPDIF input.
Right.
And no SPDIF cable that I could make was as good. But I eventually succeeded thanks to the dielectric biasing system. That was every single piece of wire and every single piece of part in Niagara is controlled for direction. And when that is done as well as is done, I mean, it's really a black and white phenomenon.
Right.
If you do it well, you do it. That means that a Niagara has both hands and one leg behind, both hands, maybe not both legs, behind its back if it's used with a power cable that has not been controlled for direction. And I try never to say an Audioquest cable, because that sounds like it's, oh, you're just selling your stuff. No, if it's hardware store cable, but you control it for direction, then you can fulfill what the Niagara is doing.
Sure.
Not as well as you can with one-to-one cables.
And at your place in Irvine, Garth actually proved to me the directionality of the cable. I mean, he went through and did a little test with the alligator clips.
That's my next part of the story.
Yeah.
Yes, he gets 3 inches of the ground conductor out of a orange giant extension cord from Home Depot, whatever it was.
Right.
If you use the same thing for you or not, and using alligator clips, just turning that 3 inches around. And he likes to do the top-down version where you listen to the system, you think that's great, and then he turns the wire around and you go, it's broken. It's broken.
That's exactly
what is still the next best system you've heard, maybe, or mismatching mechanical impedance is why horns sound like horns. Because the air inside the horn has a different impedance than the air outside, and there are reflections at that interface. And that's true between almost everything in a hi-fi system. Ours is not a world of match transmission lines. And it shouldn't necessarily be so, because you lose half the energy in a match transmission line. It's the only way to go long distance. But as with other reasons that people would do something in the pro world or the telephone company or some other world, they don't always apply to our world. People still think in our world that the reasons that balanced interconnect was made a de rigueur, have to have it in the pro world, was hum and buzz and noise.
Right, noise.
Well, that's relatively low frequency as compared to radio frequency. Wirelessly transmitted noise, electromagnetic energy. At frequencies where you can have 2 conductors where the signal is arriving at a different time, and yet it's still close enough in phase that you can have one inverted compared to the other and sum them at the end and get rid of your noise.
Right.
You can't do that at gigahertz frequencies.
Right.
Because the wavelengths, they're out of phase. It flat out. A lot of what we think about that we borrowed from old days of analog studios and the problems they had when they put too many wires next to their power cables, those are real problems. But they're not the reason for using balanced interconnect today. That has to do with optimizing the circuit depending on how it was designed. And so we have a lot of gear out there with XLR inputs and outputs that you shouldn't use because they're not well enough implemented. They're just a sales feature.
Right.
And we have other products where, oh my God, the thing is worth twice as much when you drive it the way it was designed to be driven.
Right.
But all of the ingredients that I was already using for whether it was stranded in one price range or solid conductors in another price range, and the significance of geometry, these ingredients weren't being thrown away. It was building on that foundation and adding something that I did not know enough to add, that reduced the current compression, prevented the impedance mismatch in the way in which that compressed current, improved linearity of noise dissipation. He took what I was doing to the next level by adding features, but not by saying, oh, you took the wrong path.
Right.
I was on the right path, I just couldn't go, I could only go halfway on my own.
Right. He took the best of what you were doing, able to basically describe it and then build upon it to create where we're at.
It was like
here
my
today.
farm with my fresh ingredients, but his recipe.
Yeah.
You needed them both.
Right. Enjoyed having you here today, and thank you so much for coming to the Pacific Northwest.
I love the proper dark green trees and the beauty of the Pacific Northwest.
Yes. Thank you so much, and we'll catch up here soon.
Thank you.
Okay.